It's Christmas, as you can tell by my appropriately seasonal lights, so I thought it was time to review an appropriately seasonal game. Which I realise is a joke you would only get if you'd played the game. Everdell is one of those rare games that promises you so much and delivers on so many of those promises. But you may not be interested in what Everdell promises exactly. Everdell is a worker placement resource management game where you pick up resin and twigs and berries, these cute little things and pebbles, and you build a city, the biggest, bestest, funnest city for your little critters, hedgehogs, squirrels, rabbits and beetles, so that they will have a beautifully warm and happy winter when it comes. Over the course of spring, summer and autumn leading into winter, you place your workers and collect resources, and you'll spend those resources to get your city cards, which can give you even more resources or special abilities that make it easier for you to get better cards in the future for your city. But with only 15 spaces for cards in your city, you do have to be very selective about which ones and the best combination of cards to have, with your total victory points from your cards determining who wins at the end of the game. But, crucially, you don't just get points from individual cards, but combinations of cards that work better together, kind of like sets. So, in a game of Everdell, you're not just trying to get the best, most expensive cards in the game, like the Evertree, or the Castle, or the King, or Queen. For example, the husband and the wife go really well together, and they only take up a single space in your city, which is awesome, and they're worth more points than even the King. Or maybe you'll get the theatre, which gives you an additional point for every other construction, every other building in your city kind of like it. And that's not to mention that there are also quests up on this tree here, which give you even more points if you have certain combinations of cards that are randomly generated from game to game. And one crucial game mechanic in Everdell that really changes how you play, especially with these combinations in mind, is that every critter card has a home, somewhere that they live. And if you have that card in your city, you can take the critter that lives there for free, which is brilliant, especially in games where berries are particularly difficult to come by. And the real strategy of Everdell is that it's never easy to tell which path or combination of cards is going to yield you the most points at the end of the game, especially considering the cards that you pick up or the cards that come out on the meadow and you can buy from both your hand or from the meadow that everyone has access to. Well, they're unpredictable. You don't know what's going to be coming out of here. You don't know what you're going to pick up. So if you're banking on a particular card to come up to make your strategy work, it's a pretty high risk thing to do because some cards, even though they're great, are pretty rare. So part of playing Everdell is being flexible. It's about keeping multiple paths open to yourself at the end game, while also making sure that the paths you have will bring you the most points, and the balance between those two things is hard. The end result is that Everdell is an incredibly skillful and immersive game of managing not just resources, but picking up the right card combinations and balancing different types of cards you need to maximize your points. And this is one of the real strengths of Everdell that I've found, now some several dozen games deep into it. It strikes the perfect balance between deep and simple decision-making, which a lot of games really struggle with. Sometimes it's super complex, but the decisions that you make don't matter that much, or the decisions are so simple, but they're honestly not that deep. They don't require much thinking. Everdell doesn't have that problem. In fact, where you place your little hedgehog or your squirrel worker, or which one of your few cards that you can play you pick to put down in your city, often has a pretty simple effect. In fact, you might not even be choosing between that many options. But which one you pick is usually incredibly important, often massively impacting the direction that you and your city can go. A lot of games suffer from complexity overload, where there are so many decisions that you can make that oftentimes you suck, not because you fail strategically, but because you just didn't see something that you could have done. Which is never fun, it just makes you feel dumb and useless. But Everdell doesn't suffer from that problem. You can pretty much always see all of the different spaces that your hedgehog worker can be placed, or which cards you can play. So the strategy isn't in actually making sure you're aware of all of your options, you pretty much always are, it's in picking the right option for you. And on top of this, I mentioned that flexibility is a big part of playing Everdell. So the cards that you pick or where you place your workers do also restrict where you can go in the future, because you won't have the resources, you won't have the right card combinations to make it worth it. But I've also found that it never does this to the point that it forces you into only one course of action. You're stuck with a single strategy. You can, usually, from season to season, change the strategy that you're going for, because with each season passing, you get all of your workers back and more. I was playing a game with my girlfriend last night, and she absolutely thrashed me with way better decisions in the first and second seasons. But in the third, I managed to really bring that back, and I ended up beating her by just a few points. And yes, I am using this whole video as a chance to gloat that I am now the Everdell champion, Laura. I beat your high score. Excuse me. On with the review. Like the thematic Everdell tree, there are so many branching options in a game of Everdell that even when you can't do a lot of other things that another player can, you can almost always do a lot of the things that they can't. There's enough freedom to be creative most of the time, and enough restriction to keep every decision you make meaningful, which is really important. If your decisions don't restrict you in some way, then which decisions you make often don't really matter. Part of this comes from the game setup, which varies every single time due to the forest cards and the quests. There are half a dozen basic locations where you can get the same resources every single game. The bread and butter, pebble, wood, resin, and berry. But each game you will also draw out a few of these forest cards randomly, which create new places to get resources, and they're way more powerful. I really like this mechanic because they're a small detail that dramatically impacts how you play. If you can get a lot of berries, then you know that credit cards will be a lot cheaper this game. So that combination where you work with the building that they live in and then take them for free, that's less important, giving you more space to spend on other cards. If you have a game where you can get lots of pebbles, then building cards will be cheaper. And this affects which quests you can go for, and which card combinations will be most easy to get, and which ones will be most profitable, because sometimes having resources left over gives you even more points. I've played a good few dozen games of Everdell now, and I can tell you that which quests you have up on the tree always leave me thinking, which ones can I go for? You know, which ones can I actually realistically achieve? Because I know that if I go for this one, I probably won't be able to go for that one. It's great. So what I'm trying to get at here is that Everdell is a puzzle that changes every single time, that manages to stay and feel fresh, because every single game forces you to face different challenges. But this whole engine building, resource management, card management, foresight, foreshadowing, whatever, system might also reveal why Everdell may not be for you. Everdell is more a tactical or reactive game than it is a grand strategy game. It's hard to have these grand plans that pay off in huge numbers of victory points, because you can't rely on certain cards to come up, and even if they do, your opponent might pick it up, or they might buy it from the meadow before you're able to. For example, you can get a huge number of points by using the monastery, but it really requires you to get a lot of spare wood or berries to make it worth it, and you really do need the monk card, which is pretty damn rare by itself. It may not even come up the entire game. If it doesn't, then you're out of one city space and you built your economy for something that never really paid off. Likewise, the quests only require you to get maybe 2 different cards, but if you get one and bank on the other coming up and it never does, then that's wasted space, often wasted cards, wasted resources, and I cannot tell you how many times one of the cards might come up in the first round and you buy it, and then you wait for the second one to come up and it doesn't for the entire game, and you're left there thinking at the end, I would have beaten you if it just came out. Just the one card that I needed, and that's it. And that's really annoying. I've mentioned that flexibility is a big part of Everdell's strategy. And flexibility, by the way, building a city that is able to adapt and change, that is a skill. That's a genuine game mechanic that a lot of people will enjoy. But for the people that really like big setups and big payoffs, it's not something that will really entice them. And the result is that doing well in Everdell is partly a reactive thing. It's about buying the best card in the moment from your hand or from the meadow with knowledge of what I can do within the spring or summer or autumn, thinking in terms of just the next few turns maybe, rather than 10 or 20 turns down the track, because you don't always have a huge amount of control about what the game will look like at that point. Now, none of this is to say that these plans can't pay off. For example, in my last game, I bought the monk and I managed to get the monastery, and I also got a bunch of other cards that allowed me to reactivate those cards over and over and over, and I scored like a third of my points from just the monastery and the monk alone. It was incredibly satisfying. It does happen, and you can do it. But it doesn't always do that. If you're a Twilight Imperium player, then maybe Everdell isn't for you. And hey, this is kind of why Everdell isn't my favorite game. I don't dislike it, but I love Spirit Island, where everything can be planned out and you can set up a grand strategy and watch it pay off. And you can't really get derailed by mere chance. Chance is a good equalizer in games. It can make it easier for newer or less experienced players to catch up. It can make calculating whether decisions are going to pay off more exciting when you're rolling a dice or you're not quite sure if something's going to come up when you need it. And that's okay. That's great. Some people really, really love that. And as I said, the seasonal structure, spring, summer, autumn, allows for a soft reset of the game, for players to kind of go, oh, this strategy isn't working, I'm gonna try something else. That's great. It's really forgiving and allows you to be flexible. But chance in Everdell also plays a different role. It really does change how the game plays out every single time. It makes every game fresh and variable and new with a different puzzle and different challenge, but that comes at the cost of grand strategy a lot of the time. And that's a payoff that the designers clearly chose to make. And I must mention that the meadow, which is kind of like the store that everyone is competing for cards from, as opposed to your hand, which is like your own private stash, can get bogged down with cards that nobody wants. Because come the end of the game, everyone's really bought the cards that they want from the meadow, leaving just a bunch of farms and miner moles and wives. And I would be lying if I'd said I'd never gone to the other players and go, hey, does anyone want any of these cards? And the entire table will be like, no. And so we just wipe them and get some new ones out. But there is another element that I really do want to mention: theme and accessibility. This game is beautiful. Every single card has stunning artwork. The board is gorgeous. The little resource tokens are bright and vibrant. The tree, totally unnecessary, but really draws your eyes into the game and really makes the whole thing pop, doesn't it? It's a game that really immerses you in what it's trying to get you to do, build a city. And you don't just think of it in terms of what it gives you, more berries and resources or abilities. You kind of do think, hey, I'm getting the husband's home, he's gonna live at the farm, or I'm gonna get the woodcarver who lives at the storehouse. And the fact that all the cards work together so well, like the combinations of cards aren't random but thematically coherent, does make you kind of think that you're getting a particular type of city working with a particular type or caliber of critter, let alone the fact that the little workers are great and cute and I love them. But it's also really accessible. The game is really easy to teach. It's really easy to get into. Newer players will know pretty much how the game works by the end of this first season, with the later seasons being way more important. And that is great. There are so many familiar elements to this game that you see in other pretty family accessible games, you know, things like Settlers of Catan. You've got resource management, you're building different buildings, albeit in cards, and you've got little workers that you place around the place. And that's really enticing for a lot of people. So if you are someone who has, say, a family group that doesn't really play board games, or you've got friends who like board games, but they're not going to be playing Twilight Imperium or Scythe anytime soon, Everdell is a great step up from whatever kind of more basic games you're currently playing with them. It's a little bit more complicated, but still plays to a lot of those themes and veins that they will be familiar with, while probably being more fun for you as well. So, I can totally recommend Everdell, especially to people who, love games that involve resource management and worker placement. Don't be too derailed by my criticisms of the grand strategy stuff. I am someone who loves grand strategy games, but I still really like Everdell. That's me. I think that's all I got to say. Let me know what you think of Everdell down in the comments below. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.